To the next question, we have one from David Roberts, who's based in Shepton Mallet in Somerset. And he grows vegetables, all kinds, a sort of market garden setup. It's a silt soil, and they have animal rescue there on site for farm animals which would have been slaughtered if not rescued, including chickens, pigs, rabbits, and some ducks. We could use the rescued animal manure, but we haven't, and we're in debate if we should use our own used plant-based fertilizer. Be interesting to hear if one should use on-site manure as fertilizer in a rescue setting. But the main questions are, for small-scale, quarter-acre market garden fertility building, apart from compost, could you suggest ways of boosting fertility? If you cannot have land dedicated to long stands of green manures, if we are to select green manure for 6-month stands for fertility building, which green manure would be best based on a silt-type soil? So would you like to have a go at that one for us?
Yeah, let's do them one at a time. I mean, the whole issue really around the use of animal manures from rescue animals is something which is still a bit of a grey area within the stock-free vegan organic standards, and I think we do need to clarify this. And I have spoken briefly to Dan and his father about this quite recently, because there are inquiries coming from farms similar to this who have rescue animals. My personal feeling is that yes, these manures should be used, because what else are you going to do with them? You can't just throw them away. They've come from the animals on the farm. The issue really is around what those animals are eating and what possible pollution could be coming into the farm via the food that the animals get. So there's a whole issue there around standards. In terms of this quarter acre of land that David has, he wants to boost fertility. Well, firstly, he needs to know how fertile or not his soil is. So he needs a good comprehensive soil analysis. He says it's a silt soil. That doesn't really mean very much, because most soils contain some silt. So I would need to know much more about the soil type. So analysis would give him the basic information about soil in terms of how much clay, sand, and silt it has. This is very important. You need to know this if you're going to manage soil properly, and also how much organic matter would be there. So David really needs to get a really good soil analysis, and the best place to do that would be NRM Laboratories in Bracknell. They've been doing soil analysis for organic and other farmers for the last 50 years. They are incredibly efficient and prices are quite good. If David goes to the website NRM Laboratories, he can pick various possible options for different soil analysis there. So that's the first point. The second point he was asking me was about in terms of boosting fertility, where he feels he can't really have a long-term green manure, and on very small areas it is quite difficult to justify having a long-term green manure. You have to have some green manure. You cannot farm efficiently without it, because green manure is the main source of soil biology. It's not really down to compost only, but green manures. And green manures are also incredibly efficient in terms of improving soil health through restructuring of soil. The roots of green manures are critical. And to that end, you need to have a selection of green manures. It's not possible just to say, well, you use so-and-so, because it's really down to having multiple green manures. And what we do at Harvick, we actually have very diverse mixes of green manure. We may have up to 30 different species of green manure in one place. Now, I understand David only wants to have them for a relatively short period of time. That's okay. But you will always need to try and make sure that soil is covered over winter. So you really need to be looking at green manures which you can use for overwintering, and green manures which you can undersow into an existing crop, so that you've got the green manure in there before the winter even starts. To leave bare soil over winter is very problematic in terms of structural damage and also loss of nutrient. It's actually better to have a covering of weeds rather than nothing at all. Bare soil is to be avoided, particularly during the winter. Bare soil has to be avoided at all costs. It's really, really damaging to soil health. So green manures have to be programmed really. I can't be too specific because I don't really know what David's growing on his land. I don't have his rotation or his cropping plan, but certainly he needs to make sure he's got winter cover, either through green manure or an overwinter crop, which may and very often can have a green manure sown underneath. But in terms of a summer green manure, the best ones really are things which are easy to get rid of. So phacelia, buckwheat, they're really good green manures because they encourage a lot of biological interaction with insects. But also clovers. Now, clovers will only work if they're in the ground for a period of time. It's no good sowing a clover in April and expecting it to be producing lots of nitrogen and organic matter by July or August. It takes longer. So legumes really need to have a longer period of time. And the only legumes which work over relatively short periods of time would be things like vetch, which you can sow in the spring, and you can turn that in sort of late summer. But really the best solution to green manuring really is to try and have at least a green manure which is in the ground for really more than 6 months, ideally 12 months. So you may end up dividing your land up into, say, maybe 5 or 6 rotational years and having at least one whole year of green manure. A lot depends on tillage and what David plans to do in terms of tillage. If he's using machinery, he may have to think differently. If he's doing things by hand, then the main issue will really be around how easy these green manures are to destroy, because you have to get rid of them at some point. So a lot depends on the tillage program for the land, and also a lot does depend on the actual cropping and the planned rotation, because you need to have a rotation. Rotations for us are primarily really been planned around the green manures rather than the other way around, but we're on a much larger scale, so it's more important for us to have green manures fitting in very neatly into the rotation, purely for well, not just, but partly for agronomic reasons, but also for economic reasons as well. So it's difficult to give a precise green manure that would be suitable in this situation, but there needs to be a legume of some type. Crimson red clover is really useful, although it's a biennial, but you would sow it in the autumn. You can sow it from sort of any time from mid-July through till the end of middle of September. It will flower in the spring. It has great benefit in terms of insects, but also vetch, which I've already mentioned, Persian clover, which is a beautiful smell, yellow trefoil. There's a whole range of different legumes. There are potentially 7,000 legumes that can be used as green manures, but a lot does depend on what David intends to have in terms of cropping and cropping sequence. But there's always room for green manures. There's lots more room than people realize. Most crops are only in the ground. Some of them are only in the ground for 10 or 12 weeks. But even long growing crops may only be in the ground for perhaps 20, 25 weeks of the year. So you've already got pretty much half a year when you can have a green manure. But you have to realize that clovers will not fix nitrogen over winter. They will only fix nitrogen during the spring. And if you have a nitrogen hungry crop, you need to be thinking in terms of some legumes. Applying compost is obviously a choice. And it's the obvious choice for many people in small areas. There are some potential pitfalls in applying compost, and this is something which people don't realize, but you can overdo organic matter inputs to land. We hear plenty of stories of people putting on 4 to 8 inches of compost. This is extremely wasteful. It's also very, very damaging for soil, because it brings huge amounts of phosphate and potash into the system, plus an excessive amount of nitrate. And these, nitrate and phosphate can be quite polluting. It doesn't matter whether it's from organic compost or from a fertilizer bag. It's just potentially damaging, irrespective of the source. So very large amounts of organic matter can be extremely problematical, both in terms of the pollution potential, which most people don't realize, but also in terms of overfeeding soil and creating what I call a obese soil. And this will lock up a whole range of micronutrients. Very high phosphate levels can have a very detrimental effect on micronutrients, and this will cause problems with pests, diseases. This only happens over a period of time. It doesn't happen if you just make one large initial application of compost. But a lot of small growers on very small scale tend to be using compost as a weed control mechanism. irrespective of how much nutrient they're putting on. And they're often completely unaware of the amount of nutrient that's going on, and it may often be incredibly excessive. A lot of organic growers are very quick to jump on conventional farmers for wasting nutrients, but they themselves may also be wasting huge amounts of nutrient by overdosing soils with compost. So it's not enough just to rely on compost. You have to have living green material, and the green manure really is very important, and the rotation has to take that into account. The second part of his question was what?
The second question is about alfalfa.
Oh, yeah.
Such a brilliant answer there. I mean, that's covered so much of a range there. That's excellent. So alfalfa is known as an excellent fertilizer. If we cannot grow our own and harvest, or find buying alfalfa fertilizer too expensive, could we perhaps use organic horse feed alfalfa pellets with no additives to boost soil nutrients in the short term if we are starting a garden from scratch? Green manure takes time to establish and build fertility if we use these. Organic alfalfa pellets are locally made within 1 mile of my property. No livestock farms. Thanks, from David Roberts.
Yeah, this is very interesting. It's not something I've come across before, and indeed it's not something I've even thought about. We do use an incredibly tiny amount of alfalfa meal, in fact, we buy 25 kilograms a year to mix in with our potting compost, and it usually lasts us for 2 years. We mix about 10 cubic meters of compost a year, so we use an incredibly small amount, and this is the only fertilizer we ever buy, actually, is 25 kilograms. So yes, it does have potential. It's quite high in nutrients. I am assuming that the material we buy is probably very similar to the material David is talking about. The difference is ours comes as a meal rather than as a pellet. I think the important thing here is really to check how the material is made, whether there is any other possible additives, because there may be other ingredients in there. It may not be pure alfalfa. We actually call it lucerne, but yes, alfalfa is the same thing. Some alfalfa feed will contain soya, and that soya is nearly always GM, unless it expressly says it's non-GM. It has to say if it's non-GM. I think it has to say if it has GM in it now. I'm not sure what the rules are, but that needs to be checked. And also whether there's any other possible undesirable elements which have been added to the lucerne. If it's pure lucerne only, made from UK-grown lucerne, then I don't really see any problem with this. Now, if David is certified as organic, he would have to ask his certifying body about this, as we did when we started using it for our potting compost, and they gave us the go ahead, despite the fact the material is not strictly organic, because it didn't contain any non-organic ingredient, non-alfalfa ingredients. So it would need to be checked, and certainly I think David should check on the manufacturing process and what possibly may go into it. But it may be 100% pure. I don't know. But yes, it does have potential. The thing about fertilizers is really that they're a last resort. We always reckon that if you're using fertilizers, then you're not looking after your soil properly. Fertilizers are not something which needs to be used on a regular basis. They are something which you may occasionally have to resort to when your soil management perhaps hasn't been as good as it should have been. We don't use any fertilizer anywhere in our 20 acres of field veg, and we haven't done for over 35 years. We don't need it. The soil is looking after itself. The soil is self-fertilizing through the use of green manures, wood chip, ramule, chipwood, and compost in very modest amounts. So good soil management actually means you don't actually need to use fertilizer. However, some soils may be incredibly deficient in certain nutrients initially, and there may well be a case to be using some fertilizer in the early days of conversion of land, which maybe has come from conventional methods of agriculture and may well be very, very short of certain nutrients. So again, this is really back to knowing your soil, getting a really good soil analysis, finding out what the phosphate, potash levels and some of the trace elements, what the sand, silt and clay content is, and what the organic matter is. There is no test for nitrogen. People think you can test for nitrogen. You cannot test for nitrogen. Nitrogen is not something you can test for in soil. And if if David feels he's got a need to use alfalfa purely for a nitrogen boost, then yes, there may well be some justification for that. But as I say, any fertilizer really is not the first point of call in terms of soil feeding, because fertilizers really not feeding the soil, they're feeding the plant. And the whole basis of really good sound plant husbandry is about feeding the soil and letting the plant find what it needs. The plant will always find what it needs if it's there. If the plant is in a healthy situation and the soil's healthy, the plant will find what it needs. You don't need to be force feeding plants through fertilizers if the soil's healthy.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tolly. So main thing is find out what you've got first of all before you start doing remedial work that isn't necessarily needed.
Absolutely, it may not be needed at all, the fertilizer. So David does need to get a really good soil analysis before he goes too far. And this is true for almost everybody, really. And sometimes people are not happy to spend, what may seem quite a large amount of money. I mean, for us, it's not much because we're doing it for a large area. But if you've got a quarter of an acre, a soil analysis which may be 50, 60, 70 pound is quite a lot. However, you don't buy an awful lot of fertilizer for 60 or 70 pounds either. So it could well save you an awful lot of money as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Most garden soils are very high in nutrients. It's very unusual to find a garden soil which isn't high in nutrient. And most of them actually don't need anything other than an occasional top of organic material and compost. And there's this kind of paranoia amongst gardeners and growers that they have to be continually chucking stuff on their ground in order to feed it. And this is where this overdosing and soil obesity problem can arise.
It's crazy, it is. And you only say you used 10 cubic meters on your farm per year, roughly, of compost?
No, that's for potting compost. That's for plant raising.
Oh.
We use around 250 cubic meters of wood chip compost we make from wood chip, and we use another 100 cubic meters of Ramiel chip wood, which is coming from our own wood source, which we grow ourselves, nice. And that's over almost 20 acres. So it's actually quite a very small amount per acre.
Yes, yeah, excellent. Thank you. Okay, so